continuing this morning in our study through the book of Esther. We had started last week looking at this rather rash king. Try saying that a few times. Rather rash king, Ahasuerus. And we looked at how he had allowed himself to be persuaded by his advisors to banish his queen simply because she didn't come to his party when he invited her to come. And he basically, the Bible tells us, he wanted to show her off, to have everyone look at how beautiful she is. And she was hosting her own party, didn't come, and so his advisors said, "O king, if you let this happen and word gets out, all the wives in this nation are going to disobey their husbands, and so please get rid of her, make an example of her." And so he made this rash decision after listening to bad advice. And today, even though we're still in the book of Esther, we're still not going to be looking at Esther. She doesn't come in until the third act. We're going to be continuing to look at the voices that influence the king. And there's going to be a bit of drama, so hold tight and turn with me, Esther chapter 2. Esther chapter 2, we're going to look at verses 21 to 23. Esther chapter 2, verses 21 to 23. Last 3 verses there. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Okay, so first of all, we're now introducing Mordecai. Who's Mordecai? He is Esther's cousin, and I would assume an older cousin, because earlier in the chapter, it tells us that Esther was Mordecai's uncle's daughter. Esther was Mordecai's uncle's daughter, and her mother and father had passed, and so when they passed, Mordecai took her as his own daughter and raised her as his daughter. So I'm assuming they weren't the same age. Okay. And now here's Mordecai, and he's sitting within the king's gate, and here's 2 members of the king's court. We're told Bigthan and Teresh, and they were eunuchs, and so most likely, we don't know this for sure because the Bible doesn't tell us, but most likely, if they were eunuchs serving in the king's court, they were there to serve female royalty. So most likely they were serving Queen Vashti, and so you can see maybe why they were unhappy with the king. Right? They were serving their mistress, the queen, and the king gets rid of her, and so they're still around, and so they're not happy with the king, and so they made plans, they plotted to lay hands on the king to kill him. And so, I don't know how this all happens, but Mordecai catches wind. He hears about this. And by this point, Esther was now queen, and so Mordecai, being her cousin, he has connections with the royal court. He goes and tells Queen Esther, hey, let the king know there's a plot against him. Word gets to the king, the 2 eunuchs are dealt with, they're hung, and what happened here was written down in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So this was written down, this was recorded, and it'll be important later. Not today, but we'll look at it next week. But what's happening here is the Mordecai, his deeds, they were done quietly, right? He didn't make a big deal about it. He didn't, bring a whole king's army. He just quietly told the queen told Mordecai, and it was dealt with, and it was just written down. And that was that. That's it for Mordecai. Now, we bring in the other major player in today's study. So, continue on in chapter 3. Chapter 3, the first 2 verses. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him, And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. Okay, so Haman, he's an official in the court of the king, and he was promoted, he rose in the ranks. And at this point, as we're reading the book of Esther, okay, at this point, we don't know anything about Haman except that he was an official who was promoted. We don't know what his character was like. We'll find out about it later, but we don't know much about him, and except that the king honored him and promoted him to be second in command. And the king then required and commanded that everyone should bow down before Haman. Now, if you think about the Persian culture, right? When you think about Persian culture, when you come across a dignitary, especially when you come across someone who is more honored than you are, it was customary to bow the knee as a sign of respect, right? So there was a civil kind of bowing that happened regularly, and people did it, and it wasn't a big deal. And so the fact that the king would command that everyone would bow to Haman, I think, indicates to us that this was not just a regular, oh, here comes another dignitary and we're going to bow and show respect. I believe that what the king was requiring of people was a worship, a sort of worship of Haman. Because in the Persian culture, many kings, they took on a sort of a divine presence. There was this understanding that the people regard the king as some sort of deity. And so for the king to command this worship, I think it was him requiring everyone to pay that same kind of worshipful respect to Haman. So it's different than just the formality of bowing to someone out of respect. Right? And so this wasn't just an honor, this was worship. And the king requires this. And at this point, we don't know much about Haman except that he was installed in this prominent position. And so, I would think that this requirement to worship Haman was not something that Haman asked for. At least I don't think it was. I don't think he went to the king and said, can you make sure whatever worshipful honor you're getting, can I get it too? The king just thought it would be good for Haman to have this. And as far as we're concerned at this point, Haman is still a neutral character, right? So I don't want to conjecture when Mordecai wouldn't bow down and worship Haman. I would not say that it was a personal beef that he had with Haman. I don't think it was that, Mordecai would have worshipped except that Haman had offended him somehow. This is the reason why Mordecai wouldn't bow down to worship Haman. He was simply, being a Jew, he was commanded by the Lord God that you shall have no other gods, you will not have idols, you will not worship anyone except the Lord God Jehovah. This was Mordecai's understanding as a Jew. This was my Lord's command, so I cannot worship anyone. And this was Mordecai's answer. When all the other servants in the king's gates came and said, hey, Mordecai, come on, everybody is bowing down and worshiping. Right? Actually, you see it in verses 3 and 4. Why do you transgress the king's command? Why? You're really literally sticking your neck out, asking for a beheading or a hanging, because you're disobeying the king. Look what happened to the queen. All she did was she didn't come to a party, right? This is the queen we're talking about. The queen, for not attending the party, was banished. Mordecai, do you know what you're putting yourself, what position you're putting yourself into by disobeying the king? And Mordecai says to them, I'm a Jew. That was his answer. I am a Jew, and my God says, worship no one else. And so I cannot give Haman this worship that the king is asking for. Because my God prohibits the worship of anyone besides himself. Okay, now we have a problem. What happens though in the book of Romans? Remember Paul said in chapter 13, let every soul be subjected to the governing authorities. Right? Well, what do you do with that? For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God. How do you reconcile those two? Well, obviously, if the authority commands you to do something that is against God, you obey God. You obey God. So where there is a conflict, you obey God. But where there is no conflict, then you subject yourself to the authorities. Okay? And so here's Mordecai, and it would be easy. It would be easy to say to Mordecai, look, why don't you just do it? You got to subject yourself to authority, right? Why don't you just do it? And it would have been easy. Would have been so easy for Mordecai to come up with some kind of justification or explanation. All the king's servants were doing it, right? And so Mordecai, in not worshiping, he really sticks out like a sore thumb. And Mordecai, maybe, I know you're Jewish, I know your God says you cannot worship, so what do you say, Mordecai, for your own sake? Why don't you just, put your knees on the ground, but in your heart, tell yourself, I am not worshiping Haman. My knees are on the ground, I'm just making sure I don't get killed, but my heart is not worshiping Haman. And God, you know that my heart is true, you know that I am not worshiping him, and so this way we have a good compromise. Right? I can do what the king is asking for, but not really, because he doesn't know what's in my heart, so I'm disobeying him, but only inwardly, because inwardly I'm honoring God, and outwardly I'm just fitting in with everyone else. It would have been so easy for Mordecai to do that. Right? And then this is what happens when the world asks us to do something that goes against God's commands. A lot of times it's easier to go along or half go along or just kind of, don't make an issue, right? Why do you have to raise such a fuss, Jason? Why do you have to be so difficult? We don't want to invite you to come with us anymore, because every time you come with us and we go out to do something, you always say, we can't do this, we can't do that, and you are no fun, you are what's that, buzzkill, killjoy? So please, we're not going to invite you anymore. Because you always say, we can't do this, we can't do that. Mordecai, he was a Jew. And he understood what God commands. And he says, no, I am not going to do this. So how does Haman react? How does Haman react to this? Verse 5 in chapter 3. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So here, Haman hears that Mordecai wouldn't bow down, wouldn't worship, wouldn't give Haman the worship that the king had commanded. And so Haman was filled with wrath. He was really, really upset. And I don't know about you, but in my life, I've discovered that a lot of times the devil's wrath against me usually doesn't come from external sources, at least so far in my life. Yes, there's a few people that I know who would be, I would say, considered borderline offensive when it comes to disagreeing with my faith and, kind of rubbing it in my face. But most of my friends are Christians whose faith is in line with the Bible. And so they're not going to be in my face. But why do you go to church on Sundays? Well, you go to church on Sundays too. And so most of my friends agree with me. And there's a few who don't agree and, over time have come to know the Lord. So praise the Lord for that. But there's a few who still do not believe. And we've just kind of come to the point where we agree to disagree. I believe my God, and you choose not to, and we're still friends, and we just, we just kind of leave each other alone in this respect. And so most of the wrath about my faith being antagonistic with the world doesn't come from the outside. But what happened is, what I discover is, a lot of times the wrath of the devil in my disobeying the world manifests itself in my own thoughts, right? In my own doubts about my own reluctance to follow God. And a lot of times it sounds more like this, right? Why is it that I always have to do things God's way? Right? What did we just sing this morning? God's way is the best way. Right? Well, we will sing. Sorry, I had to spoil it a little. We will be singing the song, God's way is the best way. Now, when we talk about God's way being the best way, a lot of times we think, well, if God's way is the best way, but everyone else is doing the other way, God's way is not the best way anymore because now I'm different. Now I'm contrarian to popular opinion. Now I'm not able to fit in anymore. So why? I don't like God's way. And so there's these voices in my head. Why do I have to live differently? Why do I have to sacrifice so much? You know, I can't sleep in on Sunday mornings. Right? In the evenings when people are going home after work, enjoying a nice time with the family, I got to trek all the way across town for prayer meeting and small group and, you know, all these things that we need to do to obey God. And that's just the outward things. Right? What about the thoughts that are in my head? Why do I have to be careful what I think about? Why do my little eyes have to be careful what they see? Because the Father up above is looking down to love. Why do we have to be so different than the world? Why do we have to be so odd? Right? And so these voices are in there. What's wrong with a little bit of fun anyways? I'm not hurting anyone. Nobody knows. And so it's... And I don't know, maybe in my case, it's because I am not as righteous a man as Mordecai was. And so the devil doesn't have to be very wrathful. Right? And so the devil's opposition is just more little questions, little nudges that kind of try to throw me off course. And if you look at Haman, right, when you look at Haman, the way he reacted to Mordecai stood his ground. Mordecai, he stood out in his opposition to Haman. And so Haman was so upset. He was so upset that the Bible tells us he didn't just want to destroy Mordecai. Right? The Bible tells us he didn't want to just lay hands on Mordecai alone because Haman had heard that it's not just Mordecai who's a Jew, but there's this whole group of people living in this land who are also Jewish. And then so he devises, he wants to destroy all the people of the same faith who would also refuse to bow down and worship him. And it's a systemic obliteration of everyone who would follow God. And this is because they're not following Haman. And so Haman seeks to destroy a whole nation, a whole way of life from the kingdom of Persia. He wants to wipe out any trace of God's people. And so, let's jump down to verse 8. In verse 8, we see, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries." Verse 10, so the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you." And so Haman goes to the king, and I don't know what goes through your head when you read this. Haman goes to the king and says, there's a whole ethnicity living in our midst, and they have their own ways, and they don't follow your rules. Well, I think they probably do follow most of the king's rules. I mean, they are civilly obedient, just in the matter of obeying and worshiping Haman you disobey. But here comes Haman whispering in the king's ear, "There's a people here who don't obey you, and so king, I think it would be a good idea if you wipe them all out." And here, I mean, think of a king. Can you imagine going to the ruler of a country and saying, we should kill a whole ethnicity? And the king says, "Oh, okay, well, if you think it's a good idea, here's the ring, go ahead." And here's Haman, and he offered 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents at that time was roughly 2/3 of the empire's annual operating budget. So maybe that gives you a little idea of why the king was agreeable. Think about that. 2/3 of the operating annual budget for the kingdom was being offered. So Haman's, I don't know if he's personally wealthy or if he was expecting to take all the money from the Jews after they're killed to supply that. Whatever it is, he promises a good deal of money, and the king says, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and wipe out everyone. Verse 13, and the letters, so the king writes the decree, and letters are sent out. Verse 13, and the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. And so judgment against the Jews now has been proclaimed, has been issued. The letters have been sent out, and Haman's getting his way. Haman's getting his way. And look at Haman and the king. What did they do? They sat down for a drink. They sat down for a drink. Think of the callousness. Again, last week we started looking at this, at King Ahasuerus, and I know classically we examined Ahasuerus as an antagonist in the story. But last week, as we started looking at the book of Esther, we could see how we can identify with Ahasuerus, because he is someone in charge of a kingdom in very much the same way that we are in charge of our own lives. We decide what to do, and there's different voices telling us what to do. Right? And here the king hears Haman's suggestion that the decree goes out. I mean, think about this letter that goes out. The letter goes out to the people of the land, telling them, on this day of this month, we are going to kill all the Jews, and so get ready. I don't know if you thought about what kind of letter. Look, I got a letter 3 weeks ago saying, we're going to be repaving your street between this and this date, and so get ready. And already I'm thinking, that's a lot to prepare for. That's a big deal, right? I got to park down, off the street that week so we can get to church. Now here comes a letter saying we're going to be wiping out a whole ethnicity in our midst, and so get ready. What kind of getting ready are you doing? Sharpen all your knives? But this letter goes out to the people, and the king and Haman sit down for a drink, right? The king is so far gone to the kind of things that he's doing at the suggestions of people around him. He's lost all feeling of what he's doing. And many times we can become like that. When we are so used to listening to the wrong voices telling us what to do, and we give in again and again and again, there comes a point where we get numb. And this has happened in my life. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but there's been times when I've made a decision to do something that wasn't pleasing to God. And in making a decision, had I been walking with the Lord and listening, it should have been something that pricked my heart. But because I was in a bad state, when I made a decision, this is what we're going to do, and sit down and have a drink, and we'll carry. And we become desensitized to the voice of the Spirit that would warn us, that would tell us, what are you doing, Jason? Right? So here's the king and Haman. They sit down and drink. But the whole city was perplexed. The city, they received this letter, and they were perplexed. What are we being asked to do? Haman doesn't get his worship. Haman doesn't get his worship, and he gets downright nasty. And he decides he's going to wipe out everyone who follows God. And I think we see in our lives, this is the way the world operates. If we don't submit to the world, if we don't choose to just go along with what the world tells us to do, if we don't turn our backs on God and say, whatever it is the Lord asks, I'll do it, the world gets nasty. Right? If you remember this past week in our small group, we finished the book of 1 Timothy. And I don't know if you remember this, I'll read it for you. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. Now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in the greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. The love of money, the pull of the world wanting our attention, wanting our eyes, wanting our heart, wanting our desires. All of this, it's at the center of so much of our struggles, is it not? I want to follow God, but there's something within me that is drawn by the world, and I'm in the middle, being pulled one side to the other. And our attitude toward money, I think, our attitude toward money really determines the kind of person you grow up to be, determines how you live, how you treat others. But it's not just money, the world as a whole, how we see it. And Apostle John tells us, love not the world. Love not the world. Don't love the world. Things of the world, they use it. Yes, food and clothing, Paul says to Timothy. Food and clothing is fine to have it, right? We're not called to be ascetics where I'm not going to have food, I'm not going to have clothing. Please, Jesus, put on your clothes, right? It's fine to have food and clothing. Be content with it. But when people start to worship it, right, there are those whose God is their belly, Paul says, who live their lives by what they eat. When we start to stray, when we start to chase the world, we're pierced through with many sorrows. And it's a fight. This is a fight. This is a fight of what we value, what we treasure, what we hold dear. And I say it's a fight because Paul says it's a fight, right? Continuing on in 1 Timothy. You, O man of God, flee these things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Fight the good fight of faith. And it is a fight because there is a constant fight for you. There's a constant fight for your attention. There's a constant fight for your love. There's a constant fight for your desires. The world says, I want you for myself. And you say, hopefully, well, but I am God's. And so the world does its thing, shows you all its glitter, and you say, okay, I am all God's, but okay, maybe a little bit can be the world's. And this is the fight that we are in as a church. This is why every week we come here. It's not so that, Jason has something to do on Sundays. This is the fight that we are in for our lives. Who are you going to follow? When Haman says, worship me, when the Hamans of the world say, worship me, do you bow down along with the rest of the world? Or do you say, no, because I am God's and I will not choose that? And look, a lot of times it's not in the big things that we lose our foothold. Right? I don't think any of us here, I hope not, I don't think any of us here have been forced or asked to renounce our faith at gunpoint, right? And I've shared this before. I used to have these fantastical thoughts of, if somebody comes, and especially at church, somebody comes into church with, okay, this is not a joke, but I used to think about this. If somebody comes into church and says, with a gun, and says, Jason, renounce your faith, and so here I am, and all the other Christians are looking, and this is my moment to shine, and I would say, no, I will not, and then bang, and I go to see the Lord. It's in the day-to-day situations, in the little things, that we choose to obey the Lord. It has nothing to do with life or death, but everything to do with life or death. Easy example that is so hard. Waking up 10, 15 minutes earlier every morning. How many here have trouble waking up in the morning? All right, so some of us struggle. Some of us struggle more than others. Just look, this sounds silly, right? Dying because you refuse to renounce your faith versus waking up 15 minutes earlier so you can spend some time in prayer and reading the Word of God. That's no contest. It's no comparison. It's so much easier to wake up 15 minutes earlier. Actually, no, it's not for some of us. For some of us, it might be easier to give our life once. Right? And so it's in these little things. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Sometimes we struggle with that. Sometimes we are, look, sometimes we're online, we're doing the things we need to do, and all of a sudden, something comes, you're on YouTube and you're listening to a worship song and you're trying to learn a song and then you start clicking other videos and then 2 hours later you're in like the dark lands of YouTube. And you know your eyes are not supposed to see these things. And you know God is saying, Jason, turn away, turn it off, stop it. And is it, well, okay, but just a little bit. I'm not hurting anybody. Right? In these little decisions of how we use our time, I always like to throw this in because my kids are here, and today we have 4 kids. Honor your father and mother in all that you do. Right? And many times there's a struggle to do that. Don't bow down to the world. Don't bow down to Haman. We need to make our choice and remember that it's a fight. And we're in it for the long run. It's not just one bout. Every day there's a fight. Every hour there's a fight. Every moment there's a fight for you, for your allegiance, for your worship. And so as we go this morning, I hope we can ask ourselves, and this is what we're doing at Porchlight. Plain and simple, we're learning to fight. Ask yourself, what do I choose? Who do I worship? Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you. We thank you that you love us and you desire, Lord, our worship. But Lord, you know that our hearts really are prone to wander, and our worship many times goes elsewhere. It doesn't go to you, Lord. And so I pray, Jesus, I pray as we continue to read the book of Esther, as we continue to study, Lord, speak to us, Lord, and remind us every day, every hour, and every moment to choose to worship you. And we need you, Lord. We need you every hour to help us to turn ourselves back to you. And so help us. We are asking, Lord, that you would help us, that you would walk with us and gently turn us back to yourself whenever we stray. Pray these things in Jesus' name.